All right, everyone, welcome to At the Margins, Interconnections of Power and Identity in the Ancient Near East, and welcome to Brown University. We're all excited that you are here. We've been working on this conference for over a year, so it is a little surreal to have all of you in this room with us right now. At the Margins is meant to be a conference that centers around frontier studies in the ancient Near East, sort of challenging the ideas of core and periphery, what it means to be at the margins, and what this means from various different perspectives. In order to do this, we tried to organize all the presentations into sessions based on theme. Our goal is to discuss themes around different locations rather than to discuss what these ideas mean just from a single perspective. We would also like to welcome Megan Lewis of Digital Hammurabi, who is in the back. We are very excited that this conference is being live streamed through the Digital Hammurabi channel. For those of you who don't know, Digital Hammurabi is an educational YouTube channel that does a lot to debunk dangerous ideas about the ancient Near East, but also provide very accessible lessons and introductions, as well as very cool interviews with experts in our field. Including me, apparently. Yeah, we were very lucky to have this partnership because I was the recipient of a scholarship from Digital Hammurabi this summer, which funded my own research. So I'm very excited to see where this continued partnership with Digital Hammurabi goes. That being said, you will be on, your voice may be on camera. Our presenters have already organized with us who will be live streamed and who will not be, but know that if you ask a question, your voice may be heard on the live stream.
I just want to echo Sarah and welcome all of you here. As you all know, things like this don't get put on without sponsors, so I want to first thank our primary sponsors, the Department of Egyptology and Assyriology here at Brown, the Program in Early Cultures, and the Kogut Humanities Initiative Programming Fund. I also want to thank the New England and Maritime region of the American Academy of Religion, the New England chapter of the American Research Center in Egypt, the Classics Department, the Kogut Institute for the Humanities, the Department of Comparative Literature, the Charles K. Culver Lectureships and Publications Fund, the Graduate Student Council, the Department of History, the Joukowsky Institute for Archaeology and the Study of the Ancient World, the Program in Judaic Studies, the Center for Middle East Studies, and the Department of Religious Studies. So as you can tell, we had a lot of support in getting this done. So I want to, in that respect, give a special thanks to Matthew Rutz for helping us out, Saul Olyan for helping, and very, very special thanks to Nicole Vadnice, who is not in the room today, but who helped us out and without whom this could not have taken place. I also want to give a special shout out to Pinar and Project Visiting Scholar, who helped us out along the way. If you are not aware with her project, her main goal is to help house graduate students and early career scholars at conferences like this who may not have the funding to attend. So it was our honor to be a part of an award for the first travel grant to a graduate student to attend this conference, and also be the first to get a certificate of accessibility based on her accessibility checklist. So I encourage you all to talk to her about her project. And along those lines, I want to note that this way, so if you go out the front, the next building over, not in this building because all of the rooms have big windows, but we have reserved a room for a quiet room, prayer room, lactation room. So it's the next building over in Alumni Hall. It's the Alumni Commons room. So thank you.
So I just have a few logistical things to wrap up. Everyone should have received a folder and a name tag. If you didn't, it's probably because I was running around doing all kinds of things and I didn't find you. So just grab me at some point and I'll make sure you get those things. The restrooms, there's the men's restroom is directly behind you in that hallway. The women's restroom is around that corner and there's no real indication that it's over there. So I just invite you to venture in that direction until you find something that looks like a bathroom. That's probably it. I've had several questions about Wi-Fi. Brown Guest is very easy to use. You just, push agree and log on to Brown Guest. EduRoam also works in this building. Am I forgetting anything? Oh, so we're doing a trip to the RISD Museum after the conference is over tomorrow. All presenters have admission covered already by the conference. Any participants in the conference who want to go, you'll have to get your admission at the front desk, whether with a student ID or however you do it, but you're welcome to join us. So that's going to be tomorrow, leaving from here around 3:30 in the afternoon. So. Oh, and we have lunch. We weren't initially going to have lunch, but we do. So, yeah.
So with that, we're going to go ahead and get started with our first session. So our first pair of presenters, Mahri Leonard-Fleckman and Alvise Matessi. Coming first is Mahri Leonard-Fleckman of College of the Holy Cross with her presentation titled Languaging Landscape in the Iron Age Shephelah, the Case of Timnah.
So I see I have an additional 15 minutes, so I can just stand up here and pontificate, or just speak really slowly. So I should just begin by saying that it's an honor to participate in this conference, and I want to thank our organizers for very careful, hard work in putting this together and in drawing together such a diverse group of scholars. I'm really looking forward to learning from all of you in the next couple of days. When I look at the list of presenters, I see that we have 14 total, and of those 14, there are 4 of us who specialize in some way in the Southern Levant or ancient Israel. So we have Professors Peter Dubovsky and Dan Fleming, who are textual scholars like me, but they will be not focusing on the Southern Levant here. And we have Avi Faust, who's an archaeologist. So between Avi and myself, it comes down to us, I think, to take the questions for this conference and work with them through the lens of the Southern Levant and ancient Israel. And I'm really the one who is the textual scholar. I'm not an archaeologist. And Avi, of course, will take the reins on the archaeology side. So I want to begin with some methodological grappling from the lens of ancient Israel and with the questions of this conference. The goal of this conference is to understand ancient society, specifically what are perceived to be porous, liminal, and difficult to define spaces. So like me, and like many of us here, the conveners of this group are interested in exploring lived realities in the margins of central authority, as well as experiences of areas beyond the core for their own sake and their own distinct ways of life. But how do we engage society in this way when our textual sources are likely written by a small population, arguably the educated and the elite, from the so-called core, whatever that might mean? How can we examine lived realities perceived to be marginal by some central authority, spaces that defy our easy categorization, when we may have nothing actually written from within these spaces? So we don't know what if we fill in the blank, rural populations, lower urban classes, women, etc., we don't know what they thought about their lived experiences, whether they considered themselves marginal or their identities as fluid as we on the outside might see them. And this brings me to my broader question on the relationship between history and our primary texts. So as a biblical scholar, to believe that we can gain an understanding of lived realities on the margins or anywhere is first to believe that our sources, which are largely the Bible, tell us something historical about ancient society. But the historical enterprise has always been fraught, and this intensifies, of course, when discussing the ancient world, and it intensifies even more, I think, when dealing with ancient Israel. Because all ancient texts are literary products to some extent and an amalgam of political, religious, ideological aims. But the Bible has heightened problems because of how intensely literary it is and how scarce the evidence is. We don't have multiple tablets that can be dated with any kind of precision or that give clear evidence of scribal changes over time. Our manuscripts are a complexity of strata that have undergone extensive editing and redacting and long transmission processes. The Bible is perhaps like an archaeological tell. It gives us both too much, layers heaped upon layers, and too little, often cutting out information and plot lines lacking in details and explanation. So for those of us who consider ourselves ancient historians, we do the best we can with what we have, carefully, and we allow our different remains to communicate with each other with integrity, hopefully. Various manuscripts, meager inscriptional evidence, archaeological evidence, and of course, the Southern Levant within its broader ancient Near Eastern context. So that said, this paper will be a dialogue between two sets of evidence, the archaeological and biblical, in our attempt to understand one site, Timnah, in a particular region of Israel, the Shephelah, or lowlands. Using this site as a case study and engaging with historical questions, I have two goals. First, to examine our, scholars' interpretations of the evidence, specifically how our reconstructions of Israel's political landscape affect our interpretations of its social landscape, meaning the identities of the people who inhabit it, who give place meaning and texture. My second goal as a textual scholar is to explore the dialogical process between the textual evidence or its writers and its interpreters to construct, or what I would call language, a particular vision of ancient society, and that term comes from second language acquisition. Ultimately, in this paper, I will argue that Timnah eluded scribal understanding, and so it eludes ours. It may have been within the political control of the highlands or the coast at times, but socially it remained apart. It therefore never quite fit scribal categories for self-definition or definition of the other. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. So, to step back, and I'll begin with archaeology, but remember that I am a text scholar. Timnah is located in Israel's Shephelah, between the highlands of Judah and what we call Philistia on the coast. This is a fascinating area to examine, specifically in terms of its identities and cultural distinctions in the Iron Age, at least up to Sennacherib's destruction and reorganization of the area in 701 BCE. The archaeological evidence reveals that for much of the Iron Age, the Shephelah may have been, at least from the outside perspective, a more porous social landscape, a region in which people whom the Bible labels simply as Philistine, Canaanite, Israelite, Judahite, interacted and coexisted, and identities were more fluid than our available categories. There's no clear consensus on how to reconstruct or label people in this region, and the evidence varies over time and based on the site. So for example, places like Beit Shemesh and Lachish appeared to thrive as Western Judahite towns from the 10th through mid-8th centuries BCE. But the evidence from sites slightly further west and running along the base of the hills during the same period is much more debatable. This would include sites like Tel Zait, Timnah, and Gat. Conflating political dependency with cultural composition, some would argue that these sites simply seesaw over time. So first they're Philistine, then they're Judahite, etc. Others would argue these areas reflect what we might call mixed identities between the hills and the coast, at least up to Sennacherib's campaign. And this enmeshed cultural landscape is arguably what we see at Tel Batash, the site largely accepted as ancient Timnah beginning in the 1960s. From the late Bronze Age through the Iron Age, the shifting evidence from pottery and faunal remains make it difficult to state unequivocally what this site was. So Shlomo Benimovitz and Zvi Letterman would say it was always a, quote, daughter settlement to the more Philistine Ekron, to our west, the west on the map at least. Amihai Mizar, one of the site's main excavators, has proposed that Timnah, quote, leaned towards Philistine before the 10th century, based on 30% Philistine bichromeware pottery and 5 to 8% possible pig bones. He then suggests Timnah became part of the emerging Israelite state in the 10th century, based largely in the rise in red slip pottery and hand burnish. Others, however, using the same evidence, would argue that Timnah reflects a mixed cultural population through this time for a few reasons. One is the problem of claiming an expansive Judahite kingdom in the 10th century based on an interpretation of the archaeological evidence through the lens of what some might call an oversimplified reading of the Bible. The second thornier issue is how to use such remains as pottery and pig bones as clear ethnic markers. For example, red slip pottery gradually developed mainly in northern coastal Philistia, as Amihai Mizar argued in 1998, and manufacture and use of this pottery declined during the Iron II. So it's therefore a complicated ethnic identifier for Judahites. As for faunal remains, Avi Faust and others have very carefully pointed to interesting trends related to social groups, Philistine, Canaanite, Israelite, Judahite, between the Late Bronze Age and Iron II, and a certain coherence even within the complexity. But as others point out, I also see the risk of circular arguments regarding the equation of pig bones, or lack thereof, with particular categorical groups in conjunction with perceived ideological or religious concerns versus other complicated economic and environmental concerns. And I look forward to discussing this more with you later on. After the 10th century, Timnah was then unpopulated until the mid-8th century. Its subsequent growth until Sennacherib's campaign reflect what some call interregional interaction between the coastal plain and lower Shephelah, and the evidence seems to be increasingly complicated during this time. And even after the area's reconfiguration toward the coast in 701, the evidence at Tel Batash continues to be ambiguous. According to Amichai Mazar, quote, "There is no definitive answer as to Timnah's social and political affiliation during this time," end quote. So the archaeological picture and its interpretations are complicated, particularly to a text scholar like myself. So what about the texts? Well, these include, from the Bible, 2 Chronicles 28, verse 18, which states that the Philistines raided and settled in various towns of the Shephelah and the Negev of Judah in the mid-8th century. The Samson stories of Judges 14 to 15, to which I'll return in a moment, and 2 lists of tribal land allotments in chapters 13 to 19 of the book of Joshua. These land allotments are fascinating, in part, because they are a sort of ideological roadmap for what the landscape of Israel should be, and because of ongoing debates of the extent to which these boundary and town lists reflect real historical contexts and administrative lists versus later literary idealizations of land claims written back on biblical history. Regardless of such debates, these carefully constructed lists are powerful tools for historians and archaeologists because they're essential for making claims about biblical geography, and in the case of Timnah, in equating the site with the contemporary Tel Batash. In these lists, once Timnah is allotted to Judah in chapter 15, and once to Dan in chapter 19. So I'll note 4 things about these lists before moving on. So first, as a broad statement, despite their tenuous link with history, we often use them to reconstruct the political history of sites like Timnah, including when and whether Timnah was linked to Judah versus the so-called Philistines. These political reconstructions then bleed into our assumptions about identity and the social landscape. Second, if you look closely at Joshua 15's construction of political borders, at first glance, it might seem that the borders are clear and unambiguous, but it's actually unclear on which side of the border some sites lie. This would include Timnah, Beit Shemesh, and Javneel. So, for example, we hear that the border passed north of the side or slope of Mount Ya'arim, va'avar el ketev har Ya'arim mitzafona, but then only vaguely that it goes down to Beit Shemesh, V'yarad Beit Shemesh v'avar Timnah, and crosses to Timnah without further specification of which side it runs. And the Septuagint, just by the way, replaces Timnah simply with the directional southwest here. Third, note that Timnah in Joshua 19 carries the directional hay. It's therefore perceived in terms of movement, as a space to move towards. And in fact, almost all the biblical attestations to Timnah contain this directional focus, with the exceptions of Joshua 15 and 2 Chronicles 28. And the Greek witnesses preserve this directional hay as part of the place name itself. Fourth, and finally, Joshua 19 is an interesting conversation partner, this is a little bit of an aside, with the only external witness to Timnah, the Akkadian Timnah, in the textual sources for Sennacherib's 3rd campaign. In the campaign, as in Joshua 19, Timnah is connected with another site, El-Taku, or biblical El-Teke, a name that means a place of meeting. A battle takes place in this place of meeting, in Itamirte al-Taku, in the plains of al-Taku, between the Assyrians on the one side and Ekron with an Egyptian-Nubian alliance on the other. The Assyrians win the battle, at which point they surround, conquer, plunder al-Taku and Timnah. The king then reclaims Ekron violently before the attention shifts inland to Judah. to conquer 46 sites and many more potentially connected to Jerusalem, and then the political landscape is kind of reconfigured toward the coast. Of note is the vagueness with which the annals categorize both Timnah and Al-Taku in lines 44 to 46. In the campaign, all places that are marked by the determinative uru are either specifically identified in conjunction with a ruler or in relation to some other alu or matu. Timnah and El-Teke or Al-Taku are the only two such sites in the third campaign to stand independently from such an affiliation. Their political alliance is therefore unclear and have led people to speculate that either they're two unimportant towns, they are maybe fortified cities under Ekron's control, or maybe they're part of the 46 Judahite sites that Sennacherib conquered. If we go back to Joshua 19, which lists Timnah and El-Teke and Ekron in consecutive order, it's almost as if the text is communicating with the Assyrians, laying claim to the territory Sennacherib takes, and Joshua 19 is the only biblical witness to this place, El-Teke. Our last and most important set of texts about Timnah are the stories of Samson in Judges 14 to 15. And here I'm going to rest for a little while to engage in some diachronic or literary historical work and hopefully not put you to sleep. The stories about Samson are the only set of biblical stories that take place solely in the Shephelah. In them, Timnah is a social space defined by the characters who interact there and shape it. Viewing the cycle synchronically as a whole in its current form, scholars have called the Samson cycle as a whole a border epic, border fiction, and its character is a reflection of border crossing and liminality, or my favorite, ones ensnared in otherness. However, there are few clearly defined borders in the narrative. The common biblical term for border or territory, gavul, is absent from the cycle, even though it's all over Joshua's land allotments. This perception of borders derives mainly, I would argue, from the text's bookends, the beginning of chapter 13 and the end of chapter 16, and from its placement in the arc of Judges. These bookends give the cycle a specific shape and coherence, in which Samson is arguably a judge of Israel who belongs to the tribe of Dan. We see clear classifications for Samson in the beginning and the end of chapter 13 in verses 1 to 2, verse 5, and verses 24 to 25, and at the very end of the cycle, repeated in chapter 15, verse 20, and 16, verse 31. Samson is an Israelite from Dan, according to these verses, who grows up between Zorah and Eshtaol. He is set aside for Yahweh before his birth. He will begin to deliver and judge Israel. These clear social and political classifications bleed into the beginning of Judges 14, which bridges Judges 13 into the Timnah tales, explaining Timnah as part of the uncircumcised Philistines and claiming that Samson's interest in the Timnite woman is God's doing as a pretext to act against the Philistines. All of these editorial classifications frame the Samson cycle and sew it beautifully into the broader framework of Judges, giving the cycle a particular literary coherence and order. The woman from Timnah is Philistine, Samson is Israelite. However, if we then move into the stories about Timnah in chapters 14 to 15, the landscape becomes more ambiguous. Those writing these tales are either uninterested in clearly defining the social landscape, or they purposefully create a fluid and ambiguous landscape. These stories in Judges 14 to 15 contain, again, I would argue, their own independent sense of coherence that's not bound to the arc of the cycle as a whole or its placement in Judges. In these stories, it's the very ambiguity of the space that's meaningful and that unifies the stories, an ambiguity that we find within the characters and their interactions. So, for example, these stories lack border descriptions or delineations of territory as part of Judah or Philistia, although the Philistines are described as the categorical other. Landscape is defined solely by movement up and down between the coast and the hill country. Timnah always carries the directional hay so that one is always moving toward or away from this area. The area is a slippery site defined by this particular woman and her father. We may think they're Philistine based on the beginning of Judges 14, But this identity loosens when immersed in the stories themselves. The Philistines eventually burned this family alive in chapter 15, verse 6, in revenge for Samson burning their fields in verses 1 to 5. The Timnites are therefore connected solely with Samson, not with a broader clan or tribe or the Philistines themselves. The Philistines have power over Timnah, but the Timnites are not the Philistines. Meanwhile, Samson always acts alone, disconnected from any tribe or social unit or place. Some would call him Judahite, but he doesn't appear to live in Judah. The Ish Yehudah, the men of Judah, appear in one scene in chapter 15 as a collective group. The Philistines blame them for Samson's actions, so there is some perceived affiliation between Judah and Samson. The Ish Yehudah go down to Samson and convince him to let them capture him. There is some camaraderie between them, but he's also an outsider, not quite one of them, not living among them. And one last thing to notice before I leave this text, in terms of its slippery categories, is the lack of concern with depicting any language barrier between any of the people throughout these stories. Now, in dating the Samson cycle, and here's one of my favorite images of Samson, or seeking to explain the motivations behind its vague landscape, some would argue the stories mirror the cultural ambiguity of the archaeological evidence, at least prior to Sennacherib's destruction and realignment of the area in 701, maybe prior to the mid-800s. Others would say the stories promote border maintenance and a warning on the dangers of political border crossing between Philistia and Judah to a Judahite audience, maybe after the reorganization of the region in 701. But the exploits in Timnah reflect little interest in border maintenance like we see in Joshua. Rather, the writer's interest seems to be some perceived ambiguity of the characters, some porousness of this region. We see the same interest in the Timnah of Genesis 38, the Tamar-Judah story in which Tamar arguably tricks her father-in-law into sleeping with her on the road to Timnah. This Timnah is likely a different Timnah from the one in the Shephelah, found in the area southwest of Hebron near Adullam. But in both the stories of Samson and Tamar, questionable sexual or cross-cultural activity takes place in Timnah or going toward Timnah, activity outside the appropriate contours and structures of society. Maybe the name itself is akin to what Foucault would describe as a heterotopia, an alternative construction of space incompatible with real society that inverts the known world as if looking through a mirror, a place reserved for moments of crises or for deviant characters. In the Samson cycle, this heterotopia in chapters 14 to 15 is reframed and given a new sense of literary coherence by calling the Timnite woman Philistine and by turning Samson into Israel's savior. So I'm going to close with 3 points. First, we often conflate political reconstructions with social reconstructions. Politically, in the Iron Age, we label the coastal area of the southern Levant Philistine, a linked social political structure completely separate from Judah. Prior to Sennacherib's campaign, we often view the Shephelah largely as belonging to Judah. This area then becomes reorganized towards the coast by the Assyrians in the mid to late 8th century. But this political shifting is not the same thing as the complicated portrait of identities and social distinctions that we see in text and arguably in archaeological evidence. Second, biblical texts betray an outside perspective on a place and people that elude understanding and clear categories. I argue that scribal understanding of Timnah shifted over time, what Mark Smith might call the process of shifting recollection, as did scribal ideologies. Depictions of Timnah are a kaleidoscope of options. It's part of Judah, or once upon a time Dan and Joshua. It's Philistine in the framing of the Samson narrative. It's something much more indeterminate in Judges 14 to 15. Historically, if we set composition dates aside, it seems to me that Timnah was a place desired by the political elite of Judah, perhaps under its authority politically in the Iron II period. But socially, I argue that Timnah somehow evaded the grasp of the highlands and a clear Judahite identity, or Philistine for that matter, throughout the Iron Age. Third and finally, a note for us as scholars. We like definitions and categories. We like to match history with evidence and to date clearly literary and archaeological strata. We like to impose our own shape on the other to help define it, organize it, and make it recognizable. We can see this by examining the history of scholarly attempts to define Timnah. Is it Judahite, Philistine, Canaanite? When? The Bible's categories are limited, and for sites like Timnah, we become fixed on one biblical witness or text to define what it is, rather than see the variety through the kaleidoscope. But I think texts like the remarkable literary tales of Samson in Judges 14 to 15 are an important anthropological and historical reminder that landscape, things like identities and political borders, are not so fixed and determined, neither then or now, and are often made real through the power of the imagination. Thank you.
All right, so as you probably noted on the schedule, we will be discussing both papers together at the end of each paired session. So next up, we will have Alvise Matessi of Coach University with his presentation, Not Only Bare Walls, Shifting Territorialities and Reorienting Political Discourses in Hittite Anatolia.
Thank you, and good morning to everyone. So I wish first to thank all the organizers of this conference and for bringing us together. And well, judging from the presentation that preceded me and from the program, this is going to be a very promising conference. And I think we will have a lot to learn from each other and to discuss. And well, I'm honored to be among so many scholars who have contributed so much to the understanding of sociocultural landscapes of the Near East. So, aim of my paper is to reconsider under a new light the spatiality of the Hittite Empire and its evolution through time. In particular, inspired by new theoretical perspectives originated in the field of human geography, I will advocate a relational approach to the construction and redefinition of boundaries and bounded places broadly defined. This approach will provide a new conceptual framework upon which to analyze the mutual impact between territoriality and narratives of power reflected in artifacts widespread across the Hittite domain. Recent years have seen an incredible surge in studies devoted to the territoriality and boundary policies of early complex states and empires. All these studies move across different perspectives on the ancient past, basing on different theoretical approaches, methodology, and context analyzed. However, even in such complexity, all these studies being built upon a common ground, a shared ground, upon a critique of the traditional view of boundaries as a necessary aspect of territorial political control in archaic polities. Significantly, this same skepticism is also informing recent progress in human geography and related social sciences, triggered by the collapse of the Cold War system of alliances and the boom, of course, of globalization and processes of international integration. In the frame of this shared theoretical ground, an array of often overlapping models of spatial reproduction of authority have been proposed, and you can see just a short overview on the slide. This is just a sample, okay? But what is often overlooked in these models is the temporal dimension, so that very little attention has been generally devoted to dynamic processes of formation and transformations of political spaces and their impact on other territorial as well as non-territorial manifestations of authority. Moreover, the efforts of getting rid of borders as a satisfying category of territorial sovereignty risks throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Many such efforts, in fact, renounce or fail to account for the significance of those borders that are actually documented in our primary sources or datasets. An analogous critique to mainstream trends in geographical research on the modern world was raised by the Finnish geographer Anssi Pasi. And in response to these mainstream trends, Pasi devised a series of conceptual tools that, once readapted, would lead to a more dynamic approach to territoriality and borders, also in relation with early complex societies. According to Pasi, rather than fixed, immutable, and immutable realities, territorialities and boundaries could be understood as processes that acquire and change their meanings in relation to sociocultural action and discourses. In this respect, boundaries, territoriality, identity, and narratives of power are all interconnected aspects whose transformations have bearing on one another. Independently, a similar dynamic understanding of the relation between social power and space has also entered the anthropological debate through the work of Adam Smith, cited also by, that was already cited before, who sees space as, and power interfering with one another through relations between bodies, objects, and places. These reformulations lead us to some interrelated questions that are still only marginally explored in spatially oriented studies in antiquity. The questions are, why were boundaries created at all, either as institutions or symbols? What processes led to the creation of boundaries, and how did power projection strategies change with changing meanings of boundaries? These are some of the research questions that I wish to address here, of course with reference to the Hittite world. Well, the Hittites. Hittite history spans the entire Late Bronze Age in Anatolia, covering approximately 4.5 centuries. At the beginning of this period, the Hittite state emerged in north-central Anatolia in the band of the Kızılırmak, classical Halis. A first phase, termed the Old Kingdom, sees the Hittite rulers mostly active in central Anatolia, where they increased their power gradually and with alternating success. In the following phase, termed the Empire period, the Hittites break into the international stage of the time by expanding their hegemony over much of western Anatolia, the northern Levant, and parts of upper Mesopotamia. Historical geography represents a major branch in Hittitological research, with countless articles and monographs devoted to the topographic localization of toponyms attested in written sources. Only few works, however, have been specifically concerned with the territoriality and the boundary policies of the Hittite kingdom and empire, and even less scholars have addressed these topics with a theory-informed approach. And fortunately, here we have a delegation of those who actually did. And I'm referring to Ilgi, in particular to Ilgi, Claudia, and Lorenzo. The work done by these scholars, despite starting from very different approaches and premises, their work reached similar conclusions about Hittite territoriality and border policies. In fact, their shared conclusion is that boundaries existed as symbols in Hittite worldview, but in reality they were discontinuous, contested, and possibly interspersed with political vacuums. If so, the territoriality of the Hittite state can be described as a conglomerate of interconnected, relatively bounded islands of territorial control with contested power niches in between and diminishing Hittite sovereignty towards the peripheries. This is like a synthesis of the work that has been done. However, this combined reconstruction provides us only with a bidimensional model of the Hittite geography of power, a sort of palimpsests resulting from the combination of information produced during different periods in Hittite history. But if, as Pasi proposes, territoriality and boundaries are processes in constant flow depending on and having effects on changing narratives of power, their analysis requires to consider another dimension that has so far been overlooked in the case of the Hittite kingdom and empire, and this is the dimension of time. In a recent article, and well, hopefully in a book that will appear sooner or later, inshallah, I have myself tried to fill this gap with a case study devoted to South Central Anatolia. Here, I observed that from the early empire period on, administrative units with a regional extension, let's say provinces, began to appear in Hittite texts. These provinces are named Lower Land, Mat Shapliti, and Upper Land, Mat Eliti, and the evidence suggests that they were provided each with a governor belonging to the highest ranks of Hittite hierarchy. This provincial organization contrasts with what we know from Old Kingdom sources that rather attest an administrative territoriality grounded on town-based districts, so on Uru, Alu, rather than extensive lands, so Kur or Matu. As I observed, the Hittite Empire, the Empire period provinces, especially the Lower Land, reunited many among such formerly disentangled districts, thus attesting a process of territorial aggregation. In sum, the conclusion of my previous work is that the Lower Land and the Upper Lands were created ad hoc toward the end of the 15th century by drawing together centers previously composing a fragmented network of nucleated administrative seats. Yeah. Now, there are elements, I don't know, oh, it's not going. Yeah.
There. Is that correct?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. So, there are elements, however, suggesting that the appearance of regional administrative units and their replacing looser constellations of town-based units was not just episodic or reserved to limited areas, but part of a more general process of territorial aggregation. To begin with, beside the Lower Land and the Upper Lands, other large regional provinces began to appear in the Hittite period. The most prominent case is the northwestern district of Timnah, which was fused with the district of Pala to form a larger province provided with a governor during the Casca Wars of Mursili II. This aggregative process lasted down to the reign of Hattusili III, when the province, probably lasted down to the reign of Hattusili III, when the province of Timnah was turned into a subordinate kingdom, incorporating among its territories also Pala, Dormita, and other important districts to the northwestern peripheries of the Hittite Empire. Administrative offices underwent a parallel development with a shift in related territorial jurisdictions from the town to the regional level and a contextual rationalization of responsibilities. In particular, as recently pointed out by Tayfun Bilgin, the designation Lu or Dumu, Uru and then the name, man or prince of the city, apparently disappears after the end of the Old Kingdom, leaving place to more encompassing title of Belmati and Kurti, with the heterographic writing. So Lord of the Land, attested only in Empire period sources. The Enkurti also seems to have held a top position in a three-tiers administration, including at lower levels the Belmat Galti, literally Lord of the Watchtower, and the Mashkimuru, city administrator. The Belmat Galti deserves additional consideration in a perspective on the development of Hittite territorial strategies. The authority of the Belmat Galti covered a broad spectrum of military and civil responsibilities, chiefly aimed at security management through the maintenance of fortresses and the extraction of the necessary staple and labor resources. However, his jurisdiction seems to have been exclusively limited to frontier regions, so that the title is now conventionally translated as frontier governor. Significantly, also the institution of the Belmat Galti seems to be an innovation of the early empire period, as this title is either to never attested in texts dating before Arnuanda I, so in the late 15th century. In light of their coeval manifestation, the aggregative regionalization of administrative responsibilities and the institution of specific offices related with frontiers should be analyzed together as part of a changing perspective in Hittite worldviews and territorial policies. In this respect, I find no coincidence that a new sensibility for the negotiation and the definition of borders in interstate relations emerged just around this time, so the end, again, of the 15th century. Boundaries, in fact, appeared to be employed for the first time as a descriptive category of territorial relations with the treaty between Tudhaliya I and Shunashura of Kiswatna. Admittedly, this observation, of course, might be biased by the limitations of our corpus, since all previous treaties hitherto known, which were also drawn with Kiswatna, are poorly preserved. But, however, in what remains of these older treaties, all territorial concerns are seemingly resolved in general statements of reciprocity in the exchange of individual settlements and the restitution of fugitives. So, after the Sunasura Treaty, boundary descriptions become a recurrent section in Hittite international agreements, and even the main tool for designing new political entities, such as in the case of, this is the case of Tarkuntassa, which was drawn as a new state, as an abstract, as an artificial state, let's say, in the 13th century BC. Here is therefore a first set of conclusions. At the transition from the Old Kingdom to the Empire period, Hittite territoriality experienced a radical evolution marked by the transition from a loose network of fragmented town-based districts to a more structured network of relatively cohesive regional units. This rearrangement is likely to have been enhanced in part by the Hittite territorial expansion in western Anatolia and Syria, and in part by internal processes that still escape from full comprehension. In any case, it is also reasonable to think that the new spatial order was not just an abstract imposition from above, devised in response to any specific historical event. Otherwise, I would not be able to explain its relative stability for more than 2 centuries. On the contrary, I think that the reformulation of Hittite territoriality was closely intertwined with a general restructuring or reorientation of political discourses among rulers, elites, and grassroots population. In order to try to demonstrate this, I want to draw your attention on the spatio-temporal distribution of 2 among the most widely used conveyors of symbols of power employed by Hittite rulers. These are glyptic materials, so basically seals and seal impressions on clay, and monuments. Seals certify the validity of a legal or economic transaction by symbolically materializing the presence of the certifying authority on the object of the transaction itself, or on the documents attesting it. Given these properties and the capacity of being replicated countless times, seals are a powerful tool for the reproduction of authority across space and the diffusion of the related symbologies. From this perspective, glyptic materials are conceptually quite similar to monuments that, borrowing a definition from Glatz and Plot, are a political strategy to produce and reproduce power in the physical space through the communication of symbols and the hosting of public ceremonies. The subtle ways through which this analogy between glyptics and monuments operated are especially evident in the Hittite case. In fact, it is now widely acknowledged that symbols and iconographies attested on Hittite rock reliefs are largely borrowed from the Anatolian glyptic material, where they had continuously evolved since the early 2nd millennium BC. In addition, the majority of Hittite seals and monuments have in common the use of Anatolian hieroglyphic, which is a writing system devised by the Hittites and used concurrently with cuneiform. It is exactly in the light of the shared characteristics between glyptics and monuments that the difference acquires significance, especially in terms of their use and accessibility. Seals are only used and accessed by people operating in the closed context where the sealed transactions occur. In the Hittite world, Italy, seals and seal impressions circulated only in palaces and temples and were accessed almost exclusively by the administrative personnel. By contrast, monuments can be regardless placed in both open and closed environments, where they can be more or less easily accessed by a broader audience. Hittites had, of course, their own tradition of building monuments in urban environments, generally advertising human and or divine participation through sculpted depictions and Anatolian hieroglyphic inscriptions. However, beside urban monuments, the Hittites are also widely known for a more specific kind of monuments, placed outside urban context and often in remote places of the rural landscape. These are the so-called landscape monuments. Hittite landscape monuments are mainly attested in the form of sculpted rock reliefs depicting gods and sponsoring authorities, often accompanied by Anatolian hieroglyphic inscriptions. However, many such monuments, especially those sponsored by the Hittite kings, also included built facilities such as dams, reservoirs, and roads, as well as cultic installations, and thus functioned as places of communal gathering and ritual performance. From sparse references in cuneiform texts, we infer that rituals performed around sacred monuments could attract a wide public far outreaching the closed circles of Hittite administration, including delegations of various social groups, specialized craftsmen, corvée, performers, priests, etc. In this respect, while conveying symbols of power similar to those found on glyptic materials, Hittite monuments, especially landscape monuments, had a much broader potential coverage with a spatial impact distributed over a wider area. In light of these considerations, spatio-temporal shifts in the distribution of ceilings and landscape monuments may be indicative of changing modalities of interaction between power and landscape. I'm aware of the fact that many developments in both glyptics and monuments emerged out of an inner political competition among various actors. Here, however, I will focus on the spatial distribution in central Anatolia of glyptics, and monuments used or sponsored by the Hittite great kings and queens. The choice is dictated by practical reasons. In fact, royal seals and monuments are more readily recognizable and relatively easier to follow in their spatio-temporal evolution compared with non-royal counterparts, for which we still face many problems in determining date and political affiliations. Now, let us see at the distribution. And during the Old Kingdom and the Early Empire period, royal seals and seal impressions are found in the capital, Hattusa, and in several other archives of central Anatolia. On the other hand, monuments possibly dating to this period, all of likely royal sponsorship, are very few and are all found in urban context, so there is no landscape monument known to date from the Old Kingdom or the Early Empire. However, starting from the Empire period, 14th century BC, the pattern radically changes. To begin with, very few royal sealings belonging to Suppiluliuma or Mursili are found in central Anatolian archives beside Hattusa, and none belonging to late Empire kings. This is the more significant if we consider that several find spots of Old Hittite and Early Empire royal glyptics continued being centers of regional importance down to the end of the Hittite period. Significantly, this is the situation during the Empire period, so there are not any more royal seals found in central Anatolia. And significantly, at the same time as royal seals and seal impressions virtually disappear from the centralized central Anatolian archives, Hittite Greek kings start building their monuments and carving their own image, not only in urban centers, but also in the rural landscape. This practice, inaugurated by Muwatalli in the early 13th century, will remain limited to liminal zones of central Anatolia, while no landscape monuments of Hittite great kings has been either to found in the external fringes of the Hittite Empire. So unless we are misled here by the chance of findings, these developments are probably no coincidence, rather indicative of a stark change in strategies of power communication on the part of Hittite rulers. The chronological correspondence between these developments and the transformation seen in Hittite territoriality is quite striking, and I'm tempted, therefore, to see a connection between these developments. Sorry, I think I have lost the last page. Oh, well, okay. So, I get into the conclusions. And I would thus propose this reconstruction. As long as the basis for the decentralized power in Anatolia was a segmented network of nucleated units, during the Old Kingdom and the Early Empire period, central authority was mostly mediated through the urban administrations. Hittite rulers had to focus their power claims in this direction in order to secure the loyalty of local functionaries and their seal impressions. And their seal impressions, circulated from one administration to the other, could well serve this purpose. Nodal hubs for the dislocation of resources or important religious centers could be the foci of additional efforts materialized in urban monumental programs. In the following period, when the administration is restructured upon more cohesive units, we find a more diluted political landscape. Power claims in this context, in this scenario, had to become more widespread, expanding beyond the closed circles of the urban administration. And so, hence, the resort to landscape monuments, which were relatively more accessible support compared to ceilings, which were, in fact, reserved to the administration. So this is it, and thank you for your attention, and sorry for running out of time. Okay.
All right, so at this time, I'm actually going to ask Mahri to come back up and join us for questions, and so if anyone in the audience has questions about either of the presentations, I encourage you to ask them now. Also, something that I should have noted earlier, because this is live streamed, we will also be taking live stream audience questions. Don't worry, Megan is filtering them out, and we'll make sure that we get some solid questions up here. Yes.
I have a question for Alvise. First of all, thank you for this very interesting presentation.
Yeah.
Have I understand correctly that you're looking only at royal seals, the Tabarna seals?
Yeah, yeah. Tabarna or also the seals by Tudhaliya I or...
Why not the official seals?
Okay, yeah, this is good questions. Thank you. As I said, the difficulty there is with dating many seals because you know that there have been some developments. So to follow the spatiotemporal distribution of these sealings is difficult. I will try to do that, and that would be interesting, interesting too, of course.
Do you envision that this will alter the picture much?
I don't.
Distribution geographically and probably chronologically.
Yeah. Yeah, of course, something will change, but I don't think that the general overview will be so much affected. But well, of course, we must check it. And yeah, but this is difficult because we have many problems in datings and so on, and also the political affiliations of many officials is not easy to grasp. So yeah. But thank you.
Yes. I also have a question for Alvise. You don't talk about the iconography of the landscape monuments in the Empire period. How does that, how does that support your, what's depicted on these monuments, and how does that work in your theory?
You mean royal monuments or in general? Yeah. So. It depends, so it's very diverse as a representation, but so there are some like, let's say, iconographic, let's say, representations that recur, like you see here in the the one on your right is like this relief from Yazilkaya, and you see this, it's called Umarmung Sene, with the god Sharuma in this case, embracing the king, is Tudhaliya in this case. And then you have hieroglyphic inscriptions accompanying them, and well, the one to the left is a particular one, but it has a parallel in a seal, as you see, which is, I'm not an expert in iconography, yeah, so just
Maybe the evolution of these forms or patterns.
it's difficult to speak about evolution because they are all concentrated in like 50 years, something like that. So there is not really,
If I can pick up, I think what Ken is saying is very interesting, and it is, as you were saying, very challenging because the chronology of many of these beliefs is not so easily set up. The fact that the aim is not mimetic but symbolic makes that the repertoire is very much the same. And for us, for example, the backdating of the Alaja-Huyuk complex completely changed the way you interpret the development. I think that one of the challenging of chronology that both Iggy and Alvise were mentioning is also such a challenge to give a historical evaluation of the phenomenon.
I wonder, I'm just thinking that things that are rural don't have to necessarily be isolated if they are along a road which may be heavily traveled. I just drove across the country on I-90. There's, a fair number of people there, even though you're in the middle of Montana. And whether these might be more addressed to traders, and whether the whole sort of schema might be more addressed to collecting tolls and tariffs rather than
Yeah, so thank you for your questions. When I said isolated, I meant isolated from the main administrative centers, so isolated from urban environments. But of course, this is so most Hittite landscape monuments were placed in they were placed in places of interaction in a way. So there were roads, yes. Some of them was actually isolated, so not really visible from afar, and you could go there only knowing that the place was there, like Yalburt but they were for sure places of ritual performance. This is something we know also from the texts. We know that there were rituals performed in front of monuments, and so the Huwazi stones that were stelae and so on. So we know from the texts that there were places of ritual performance and ritual gathering, and these rituals were open to like a broad spectrum of the population. So we don't know exactly who was involved, but we have some ideas. So, as for the relation with other aspects, like with commerce or so on, I don't know. So for sure there were places, so many of them were placed along roads, as you said. So, for sure there were places of transit. And so there was also some economic aspect related to it, and yeah.
Question from Mahri, trying to kind of make a connection between the two talks. So I started by wanting to ask you how you relate your findings about Timnah to the Shephelah, to the kind of larger foothill region across the coast and the highlands. But I was also reflecting on this whole discussion of borders, and was wondering if, when you consider the larger space that you're thinking about and the question of identities and what we can and can't know, and even thinking about how people make these identifications as Philistine or Judahite or none of the above based on certain kinds of evidence, and then just listening to the set of questions that came before for considering Hittite boundaries and indications of Hittite presence. And I was wondering if you could take your pick of what you'd like to say, that when you're working in such a different environment in terms of evidence, in terms of the political entities in play.
You mean the two of us?
Yeah, between what you're doing and and the whole set of Hittite questions. And I actually, in doing my paper and having chosen, in a way, from the vantage of Amar, to be engaging in that conversation, I thought of your project and how different it strikes me in terms of just the entire situation. And I was curious if you could reflect on that. Or at least talk about your own stuff. But does it not seem so different? Like the kinds of evidence they're calling on.
Yeah. Yeah, without knowing, because this is not my area of specialty, nor is yours mine, correct? Unless you...
Exactly.
It strikes at the first thing that comes to mind, and I think this is something I would need to sit with, and I'm sure I'll have many brilliant ideas in about 15 minutes. But, it strikes me how completely dependent we are on the sources that we've got, in a way, and that those sources can be really distinct, depending on where we are, and also depending on what specialty we have. Like, I think it was really interesting, the kinds of questions that came out, and just are we in art history? Are we, what exactly are we dealing with? What's our area of specialty? And so that's just one thing that strikes me, is how our kind of dependency, in a sense, on what we've got. And I also wonder to what, and this is a question, I guess, for all of us here as we listen to all of the different papers, but I wonder to what extent we can make broad statements, like we can take a particular set of a place or people, time period, and use that to make and connect and make kind of broad statements about some other place, a very particular time or changing time periods, which gets a little bit more into theory, I suppose, but how that's helpful and how maybe really just staying really particularly rooted where we are gives more integrity to the material that we've got. That's what first comes to mind, I guess.
Yes.
I don't know if you have any.
I also have a question for Mahri. I really enjoyed your paper, and this might be a little bit of an optimism against what you just said. So, thinking of many works Alvise has quoted, of Claudio, of Hugi, and so on, thinking at the Shumashura Treaty, this lent in between two lines that are described there. This was my way of reading Timnah and the situation that you present. And we have no whatsoever sources that we cannot go through archaeology to investigate that, not yet at least. So you have filled a vacuum a gap in historical case that I can reach. My question would be on your conclusion. And you have advocated for the risk to not conflating a political with a social sphere. And I have the opposite problem. So many times when you discuss marginality, borders, and so on, it seems to me that the political sphere is seen as an overstructure, something that it's there, and when politics goes away, it's no more there, as if society would be independent. I will talk about resilience and people. Can you expand a little bit on your conclusion and how you link it to your case now?
So just so that I understand you a little bit more, you're saying that people have a tendency to do the opposite? Is that what you're saying? That society is kind of everything?
Divide it very much. So you're
divide
talking about the political sphere that is superimposed and then disappear and then superimpose again. And it seems that society goes on. This is, for example, the common way to look at pastoralism. It continues, what is outside of the urban centers continues, whatever it happens, unrelated, as if social sphere would be unrelated.
Interesting. Yeah, I think when we're talking about ancient Israel, we have kind of this old tendency towards historicity. We want to know exactly what happened and when. And part of understanding exactly what happened and when is actually looking politically in some ways. Like when we get into conversations about, was there a united monarchy? When did a divided monarchy happen? Even about writing. Did writing happen under the Persian Empire? Did it happen did it happen kind of prior to the 500s BCE? So there's a way in which when we talk about ancient Israel, everything becomes absorbed into questions about politics in a way. And so that's what I think I'm trying to argue against, is just to be really, really careful not to let those kinds of questions, when did a particular political group control a particular area, kind of then bleed into questions about society, which I think, at least when we're talking about Israel, is much less certain, much more vague. to really understand what's going on there. But I also think, I've just been reading a lot on the history of historical studies, and I find it really interesting how for a long time it seems like we were very much focused on the politics, like political history was the way that we understood things, and then there was a real pushback into social history, and that started to kind of fragment the field, and for a long time society was in the same way that you're talking about. And I think we're getting to a place where we're maybe starting to bring those things back together. But that also struck me in terms of what you were saying.
Thank you very much for your talk. I'd like to ask this question about the political geography and social geography. Because political and also social, we can reconstruct it, geography, we can reconstruct it for certain periods, like for Neo-Assyrian period or late Bronze or early Iron Age. And okay, so we have certain sources that we can reconstruct it from those sources and tell that this is a political view, this is a social view of that period. But if you think about sources you have been using, especially Joshua and Chronicles, we are in a completely different period, in a post-exilic political, you can call it imagination, creation, construction, or whatever, of social environment which is not realistic, which is not there. So we cannot speak about social geography, but we can speak about sort of imagination of social geography in certain period. So how do you distinguish social geography and imaginary social geography?
This is why I love the stories of Samson, because the Samson story, I mean, they're just like fabulous stories to begin with. I'm not using these to make historical claims, but there is a real attempt, you can tell that there's this real attempt to talk about people, like specific people, and imagine place through characters, and those include women. And so there is something that's being, this kind of imagination, kind of society that's happening, specifically in some of the stories that we have. So I think that is kind of what you might call imagined society in a sense. But I think when we're talking about the Joshua borders, or we're talking about the Neo-Assyrian royal annals, we are talking about something totally different that's very much about politics and ideology. We don't have people there. We're not talking about little people on the ground. We're talking about, which place is designated as a land and which place is designated as people, and it's much more about politics and political boundary shaping. I think that in some ways one could argue that they're all kind of imagined in some sense. I mean, some are more historical than others. But I think you can actually look at the different texts that we have and get a sense for whether there's an attempt to understand society. And I think you can't totally distinguish politics and society here. They're also linked, very much so. But there can be some kind of larger attempts to understand people and how they work and interact. And then there can be some texts that just that's just not at all the aims, and they're doing something totally different that is very much politically driven, primarily politically driven, without anything else, or any connection to society. So I think you bring up an interesting question, which is really knowing what texts we're using, and I've kind of amalgamated them all just to talk about one site, so.
One more question? Yes, we have heard from
Thank you for both papers. One thing that came from many of the comments was the relation, both of you specifically mentioned it, is the relation between between political boundaries or political situations and ethnic boundaries or ethnic identities. And both, I agree, stated that it's not the same. There is connection, at least in one sense, and that states, especially empires, do try to force identities. they don't like people changing and shifting, and they do try to label people. It helps in managing people. So my first question is to you, and it's a question of an ignorant, I know nothing, but on the maps that you showed, on the process that you described, could it relate also to something like that? When the move is from like governing through cities to governing in, if I understood you correctly, regions, could it be related also to the way now an empire or a strong state is trying to fix people, to identify them in order to have control? They don't have to be Hittites. I mean, they don't have, but again, give them fixed identities. And moving from that to Mahri, people have many identities. So people can have the name, the kinship identity of the family. They have the local identity. I mean, being a Timnahite could be an important part of my identity. It could match or be partial with the kinship identity. I have, or sometimes called, but it's a tribal identity, or I better like come out of totemic identity. And then there is higher, more complex identity, which is ethnic identity, which is what you alluded by Philistines, Israelites, Canaanites, and other terms that we give to large group or meta-identities maybe. And that's my point of the question. People hold those identities in parallel. It's not that you have either. You can have all of them. I can be from a mishpacha, a family Hanan, I can be a Timnahite, I can be Danite, and I can be Canaanite. And when we switch identities, it's not so much that an Israelite becomes Philistine, or I don't know, you can call them a different name, but people, when circumstances change, they suddenly don't stress them that they are Canaanite anymore. Suddenly, they are Timnahite. That's the most important thing. And then it helps them, and that's again the fluidity of identities in changing from Canaanite to Timnahite. Then I can connect me being Timnahite with, let's say, with the Israelite through fictive genealogy. That's why that stops when a strong state make it like permanent, when it's written down. And then, by being a Timnahite and a distant cousin was an Israelite, I suddenly can affiliate with Israelites, which perhaps it was more difficult to do earlier. So I think that's how it changes, and that's a comment. Finally, and perhaps in difference to what you pushed, you mentioned the chronicles and other texts are very late, so someone with a later period, someone imagine social geography. But I would throw, and I know it's not what you're saying, but I would throw and say that I think the stores in Samson, which I agree that are early, but I think could only reflect an either slightly earlier situation, because people at the time of the empire, Assyrian Empire, it was more difficult for people to manipulate identities or states. But I think it could very nicely correspond with the early Iron too. At that time, people would really, I think, manipulate identities. So for the long comment and question, but
just to respond directly. When you talk about the fluidity of identities or how people can take on multiple identities, and I think even in a contemporary world, we can all appreciate that. I think many of us probably have the feeling that we have multiple identities. What then I find really interesting is when we're talking about at least the biblical sources, those always seem to be imposed from, there's a very particular people deciding what those are for others. So we're not seeing from, we don't have any texts from Timnah. I mean, I guess you could maybe make that argument, but so that then becomes just an extra layer for all of your complex, statements about identity. Is that we're out here, we're getting everything from potentially somewhere else. You would disagree?
you don't have any text in Timnah, so you don't know.
Well, exactly. That's exactly my point. Is that we don't know how they would identify themselves. So that makes it extra interesting then. We do, yeah, we do have archaeology, and then how we interpret that becomes very interesting as well. So, my statement, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, as for the Hittite case, ethnic identities do not seem to have played a role in the definition of political landscapes. Actually, the names of the two provinces, Lowerland and Upperland, were completely, how to say, anonym. So they did. Yeah, exactly. So it didn't have any relation with population actually living there, and rather than. So when ethnicity or let's say local identities play a role in the Hittite society, we see that they were not manipulating them. They were actually trying to prevent manipulation, because we have like this local, the cult inventories of local cults that were made just to like fix the way local cults were performed in order not to modify them in the future. And so there was like, the attempt was actually the contrary, not to manipulate, but to try to integrate. And then, well, we have some, maybe there was some manipulation, but this is not something we can actually grasp. And so, yeah, basically, ethnicity did not seem to have played a role in the definition of the political landscape of the Hittite Empire. Well, at least in Anatolia.
All right, so we started ahead of schedule, but we are now back on time. So we're going to take a quick coffee break. Please join us back here 5 minutes before noon, so at 11:55 to start the second session. Let's thank our speakers one more time. All right, we'll see you in about 20 minutes.